Wednesday, and this week we're returning to the Ice Age.
Will be. Hang on a minute.
Ice Age technology isn't all that good.
Is it not working still?
There. Now, just to introduce you to why I'm doing this, before I worked for the Wildlife Trust, I used to work as an archaeologist, and my speciality was small mammals from the end of the last Ice Age. And this is the sort of place I'd be working in when we were doing field work. So this is one of the caves in the Wye Valley. We were there at the 1995 onwards. I'm sorry, the date on this is wrong.
Sorry. Hang on, wait. Right now, please.
This is one of the other caves in the Wye Valley. This is Merlin's cave. The previous one had human occupation in it. This one didn't. It only had small mammal bones. So this one was really an excavation that fed directly into my PhD. My PhD I did between 1999 and 2003, and it was about small mammals in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, so the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the warm stage we're in now, and all about the small mammals in southwest Britain and Wales. And this is me many years ago digging in Tornewton Cave. This was part of the Torbrine excavations that we were doing between 1990 and 1995. And what I'm digging is a very small hole at the top of a ladder up the cave wall. The hole was about as big as I am. So basically when I crawled into it, that was all that was left sticking out, and the rest of the cave was full of me, which made life a little difficult after you were in there for a while because you ran out of oxygen and had to come out and breathe again. At the end of the cave, there was a wolf den, and we found in that the milk teeth of wolves and bits of reindeer bone that they'd been using as teething rings. So, absolutely fascinating thing to do, slightly uncomfortable, but great fun. Just a little bit of background about the Ice Age. This is the most recent advance of the last ice stage we have. This is the Devensian glaciation, and as you can see, at its greatest extent, this was as far as it got. It didn't get right down to the south of England at all. It came out halfway across Shropshire, probably about as far as Church Stretton, but bits to the east of us were quite clear of ice. And the period we're looking at this evening are the bits at the top there, the late Devensian, the Dimlington Stadial, the Windermere Interstadial, and the Loch Lomond Stadial. So basically, an interstadial is a warm period during a glaciation. So an interglacial is a warm period between two separate glaciations. This is just a phase. And at this time, we were still joined onto the continent. Or the continent was still joined up to us, if you prefer. Remember where the ice sheet went. Our ice sheet might have joined up with the Scandinavian one, but there was always a land bridge that was free of ice between the east coast of Britain and Belgium, Netherlands, these sort of bits. So plenty of scope for things to go backwards and forwards. The area between East Anglia and where the North Sea is now was known as Doggerland, and there have been quite a lot of recovery of things like mammoth bones and woolly rhino bones from what was basically a cold desert that ran between England and the Netherlands. Just another map showing you when different glaciations occurred. The one we looked at before is labelled 2. The parts labelled 3 were affected by the Anglian glaciation but not by the Devonian, and 4 never had any ice on it at all. 1 is the most recent re-advance, so there was a very short, very sharp cold phase right at the end of the last glaciation. That's Loch Lomond Stadial, and there was an ice sheet in the west of Scotland. There was another one probably in North Wales, and a bit in the Lake District, so only in high ground. So really that one didn't put ice over Shropshire, but we would feel the cold effect of it. And just a little diagram of how a glacier works. It accumulates on the top of a mountain or whatever during the winter. It slides down the hill with the weight of the ice and things. In the summer it melts at the front, and as it goes it carries enormous amounts of rocks and rock dust and grinds stuff up as it goes, like you're pushing a huge paving slab along and piling up dirt in front of it and under it. So this is where all the glacial moraine comes from, and why you get banks of moraine forming landforms in Shropshire. We were right on the edge of the main advance, and also glaciers, as you see, they do move. They go backwards, they retreat as they melt, and they come forward again as they freeze up again. And the area certainly around Ellesmere, between Ellesmere and Whitchurch, was affected by glaciers advancing and retreating. We were also affected by glaciers coming from North Wales and from the Lake District. So lots of interesting things going on in the north of Shropshire there. This is just a little diagram of how a kettle hole forms. Some of the meres were formed by kettle holes. The little pimply lump is a leftover piece of ice, like an orphaned lump of ice, which is then buried in moraine as the glacier retreats. As the ice melts, it falls into a hole, which then fills with water. So that's basically a kettle hole. Things like Kettle Mere and Crow's Mere are probably little kettle holes. And this is the formation of mosses. So all of those meres and mosses in North Shropshire are glacial formations and wouldn't be there before the glaciation. It's very difficult to know what was there, because of course the glaciation pushes all that moraine around and really wipes out what was there before. But this is the landscape we've got now, with the kettle holes and the moraines, and really everything else completely scoured out. And what we would have when the ice wasn't covering most of southern Shropshire all the time, but as the ice retreated, it leaves a tundra environment which is got lichens, lichens, and little mosses, simple plants, before the ground is stabilised and a proper vegetation grows up. Now, I want you to imagine that we've got one of Stuart's camera traps and we put it out about 40,000 years ago. So this is when the first modern humans came into this country. Remember that the dates really are a bit difficult because it depends where in Britain you are. Things move backwards and forwards. We don't have a lot of mammal bone from Shropshire. We haven't really got bone caves or anything. It's not preserved properly. So we really have to use sites in places like the Cheddar Gorge sites or the Creswell sites in Derbyshire that have good bone assemblages, and that's how we know what was around. There's no reason to think that just because we haven't got the remains of animals, we didn't have any animals. It's just that they're not preserved here. So we're just playing at, like say, having Stuart's camera trap there for 40,000 years. So this is before the last glacial maximum. Anything that was left over from there would be completely obliterated by the glaciation. So here we have the earliest human beings. Before that we had Neanderthals, and sort of what was referred to as the lower Paleolithic, if you like. The lower and middle Paleolithic were not modern humans. So this is the first influx of modern humans, and the fauna they would be hunting are big animals. This is the megafauna. Basically, they were pretty much carnivorous. They were hunting, I mean, something like a mammoth, you could feed your family for a week. It's like doing the big shop. Not only that, but you've got lots of useful bone and hide and tusks and things like that for making tools and for sleeping under, and they've got lots of useful raw material in a mammoth, not just the meat. But whopping great big things. Of course, they're one that we do have evidence for in Shropshire, because the site at Condover, where they found the remains of 3 mammoths in what had been a pit, they sort of fallen in and got trapped, and the bones were found, and these date to about 12,500 years ago. So they're actually part of the late glacial interstadial. So these aren't the very earliest stuff we're looking at. They were there before the glacial maximum, and they're there again after. They're the most complete and best preserved mammoth skeletons in northwest Europe, and the only late glacial mammoth skeletons in Western Europe too. So before these were found, we didn't really know that mammoths were still around at that point. That's why I put them in at the beginning. So if we're watching Stuart's webcam, there they are in the earliest bits of it. Then we have the long freeze when nothing much is around, and then back come the mammoths. So I'm not sure we get a good view of them like this on the webcam, probably just get their feet or something, but there's the mammoths. About the size of a modern African elephant, but a rather different shape. You can see they've got the very high shoulders and very small ears. Small ears are an adaptation for cold weather. Basically, if you had those huge ears like an African elephant, they'd get frostbitten. So these are adapted for the cold, and they're on what it's referred to as mammoth steppe. It's a grassland. There's no trees. They're eating grasses, sedges, small flowers, this sort of thing, but it was a treeless environment at that time. At this point, basically the climate is deteriorating towards the glacial maximum. Here's a pair of woolly mammoth. Sorry, rhino, woolly rhino. Horn on the front gives it away, doesn't it? About slightly smaller than an African white rhino. Nice furry coat to keep him warm. Very long horns. The front horn could be 5 feet long. I mean, seriously well-armed creature. Again, hunted by the human settlers. Another interesting one, this is a Saga Antelope. They're very much a steppe species. You find them now in Russia and Mongolia. They're quite scarce now, but they're very much adapted to steppe environments. They tend to run along in single file, and their noses filter out the dust. You have to remember, it was a dry, cold time. It was also dusty because the glaciers grind the rock up and it gets blown for distances. So these things are running along, and they need these adapted noses to breathe through. People used to think that they drank through them as well, but if they don't, that's rubbish. But yeah, nice little creatures, sagas. Like I say, there's not very many of them about now. This is a giant deer. Now, it doesn't look too giant in this, but on the webcam, we'd have seen it looking absolutely huge. They're about 12 feet at the shoulder. The antlers are over 12 feet from tip to tip and weighed about 40 kilos. First of all, imagine having 40 kilos of antlers on your head. And second, imagine having to cast them every year and grow them again. So, probably not a very common animal. Possibly because it's a bit maladapted, really. They were hunted. They were, I mean, 12 feet at the shoulder. It's a big piece of meat, and the antlers were useful for making tools. But of course, once you get into a woodland situation, these things are absolutely hopeless. They just can't cope with close woodland, so they disappear basically. They become extinct. So we're getting them on Stuart's webcam, sort of before the full glacial, but after that, pretty much they've gone. About 11,000 years ago, they vanished. And we've got some elk here, what would be moose in North America, same beastie. They're called elk in Europe, and Scandinavia, they get them there. These were quite a common creature in Britain, and they could cope with fairly open environments and woodland. They like, I mean, in these days they tend to like fairly damp places, probably the same then, no reason to believe not. And again, they were popular prey. They were meaty. They got big antlers. It's a useful thing to bring back to the cave. You could use all sorts of bits of them. All of these things, of course, have a role as managers of the environment, of the how the woods are, this sort of thing. They're browsers. They tend to eat anything young that's growing up, so they're actually controlling the spread of woodland to a certain extent. There's some evidence that during the interglacial periods there is a bit of development of birch woodland, but nothing much more major really until we get to the end of the Ice Age and everything warms up properly. This fella here looks. I mean, you probably imagine that's just sort of like a normal bull. It's an aurochs, which is the ancestor of domestic cattle. They're absolutely huge. It's not something to be taken on with faint heart. You'd want a very long spear, I think. And these survived until about 3,500 years ago. So they hang on well after the Ice Age. About 6 feet high at the shoulder. This is a bull, obviously they're a lot bigger than the cows. And the horns would be about 30 inches long on each side. They like floodplain areas, marshes, this sort of place, hang around in damp places, wettish woodland, and again, keeping clearings clear, keeping the sides of rivers and lakes clear. Red deer would appear on the webcam really throughout. They're there before the glacial maximum. They're there after the glacial maximum in the late glacial interstadial, and then they they disappear, if you like, migrate off when we get into the cold phase of the late glacial stadium or home and re-advance, but they're always nearby. Remember, these are big migrating animals, so they're using the land bridge, they're moving in and out of the country, they're moving north as it warms up, and they're moving south as it gets cold. So you probably always find some somewhere. Wild horses were a major source of prey to the human beings settling here. These are very much, again, a steppe variety, really. These ones are pictured in woodland, but in England, in Britain, they were really associated with less forested environments. So they're going to appear on the webcam both before the full the glacial maximum and again afterwards, and they pretty much disappear again in the late glacial stadial. So that's a phase that an awful lot of things that were part of the megafaunas are vanishing. And whether it's actually it's not that it's too cold for them, it's just that they disappear at the end of that because they can't live in the woodland. Once you get into the Holocene, everything warms up very quickly. You get woodland developing quite rapidly, and these creatures of the open plains really don't like it too much, so they just vanish from the British fauna. Reindeer are another one that we're going to see right through the sequence of photos. They tend to live closer to the ice sheets, if you like. So they're moving up and down, following the colder weather, and maybe being pushed out a bit by some of these warmer things that are coming in. Very popular prey item, and once you get into the late glacial stadial, we haven't got humans then, but reindeer would be very much part of the fauna. People chasing a mammoth and people chasing horses. One of the preferred ways of catching horses is to chase them off a cliff. It saves getting too near to them and getting kicked. Of course, we're a bit short on cliffs in Shropshire, but possibly a bit of Wenlock Edge could have been useful. Some of the predators from before the glacial maximum, huge things like cave lions. Basically, remember, these people were actually human beings were using the caves, but if you got there and discovered there was already a cave lion in residence, you would very quietly go away. These are 25% larger than African lions. They don't have the heavy manes. They're a cold adapted species. This one appears to have lost its back leg, I'm afraid, but there we go. The hyenas also, before the glacial maximum, these died out about 22,000 years ago. You wouldn't want to share your cave with them either, but there's a lot of evidence that the caves that were occupied by humans were also periodically occupied by hyenas. So, one would move in, the other would move out, and backwards and forwards. Twice the size of an African hyena. Rather smaller ears, heavier weight, cold adapted creature. They were associated with the mammoths and the woolly rhinos and the horses, and of course ate all of them quite cheerfully. Looks very similar to an African hyena. More than 20,000 teeth of hyenas were found in the cave in Tor Newton. That's the one that there was a picture of me digging in. So obviously occupied by generations of these things. There's a cave bear or grizzly bear, which was there before the glacial maximum. They were really big. the ones after the glacial maximum became rather smaller. Brown bears, of course, continued well into the Holocene and were a normal part of the British fauna. Wolves would appear right through. They're nicely cold adapted. They got a bit smaller when it was warmer and a bit bigger when it was colder. And Arctic foxes appear in the cold phases. So these are there in the late glacial stadial and busy looking terribly cute. Lynx appeared, disappeared, appeared again and survived into the Holocene. They were quite widespread and of course hunted out quite early on though. And these are just a couple of the owls, snowy owl and eagle owl there. Particularly interesting to me because they gather up the bones of these little fellas, and these are my favourite things, if you like. These are the things I specialised in. So we've got two kinds of lemmings here, three kinds of lemmings in fact, Norway lemmings, wood lemmings and collared lemmings, and these are the cold phase small mammals. So when you've got a cold period you get lots and lots of bones of these little creatures. They're particularly useful in as something in archaeology really, because owls are pretty indiscriminate feeders, and if it's small and furry and it runs, they'll eat it. So they gather up just about whatever's there. Everything else that lives in the cave, like whether it's human beings or hyenas, are quite selective. So human beings don't tend to, they're picking the things they want to eat. They're not necessarily collecting the bones of everything that's there, which doesn't necessarily give us a proper view of the environment. But the small mammals can give us a very clear impression of what's going on. Of this lot, the Norway lemmings particularly tend to inhabit the damper, mossier, sedgier sort of bits of the landscape. And the collared lemmings are on the higher, grassier bits. The grass is quite coarse. You can tell from the teeth of a collared lemming that it's designed to eat really coarse grasses. They have quite recognisable teeth and lots of them. Basically, if you've got a cave that has owl nests in it, you're going to get great heaps of these things. Some of the other cold phase ones, the narrow-skulled voles and the northern voles, both extinct in this country now, and the grey-sided vole, which is the grey-sided vole's a particular favourite of mine. Hang on, just let me have a look. He appears in the late glacial interstadium, so he's in slightly warmer weather. They live these days in Scandinavia. They're a sort of they are cold adapted, but not very, very cold, if you like. And these things, they're very similar to a bank vole, but the teeth are distinctive. They hadn't been recorded from British sites until the work I did for my PhD. So I was terribly excited to find one of those. I think previously people had seen it and thought, oh well, it's a bank vole. It must be intrusive, because some of these small bones can trickle down through deposits, but in fact, if you look carefully, it's a different creature, and it's a tundra creature. Arctic hares appear right through, and on the other hand, on the left here, we've got a steppe piker, which is another lagomorph. It's a rabbit hare family. They have little short ears and no tails, and they're absolutely charming. You find them in Mongolia and places now, in similar steppe kind of environments. These creatures only appeared during the Loch Lomond Stadial, so cold period right at the end of the last ice age. And they're a very important marker species, because if you've got bits of piker, which have very distinctive teeth, you know that it's exactly that period, which lasted quite a short time. So it's a very easy way of saying, okay, that's after we would expect to have Upper Paleolithic and before we would expect to have Mesolithic. So that's got to be Loch Lomond Stadial, about 10,000, 11,000 years ago. Absolutely charming things. They sing in the mornings, they build haystacks for the winter, and they mark their territory by doing a handstand and wiping poop down rock faces. Absolutely lovely. And this is a bit of the bone breccia from Merlin's cave, showing all the bits of bone stuck in the brecciation. So this is a solid lump of sort of what would be stalagmite material, which has got the bones set in it. So it was a very dense deposit. The cave was absolutely full of it. So owls had been living in there for quite some time. This is just a quick list of some of the things you would find actually just before the glacial maximum. It's got the hyenas in it, it's got the giant deer, it's got bison. We don't get those things reappearing in the late glacial interstadial after the glacial maximum. We get a few different things, and then you get the cold period at the end with the lemmings, and interestingly enough, water voles hang on through there. They do occur quite far north. Saw lots of them in Sweden. They sent me there on to study lemmings, which was quite interesting, really. I saw one. It wasn't a good lemming year, and the only lemming I saw was the backside of one disappearing over a hill, closely pursued by a gerfalcon. Lemmings, of course, have a cyclic population, or the thing about them committing suicide isn't quite right, but they do have boom and bust populations, as do, in fact, the voles. But it must have been a bad year for them, because I just saw one. But absolutely fabulous stuff. And for those of you who like plants, I'm sure there must be some of you, here are some of the things you'll be getting in the late glacial interstadial. So this is the warmer period, and we've got things like juniper and buckthorn and saxifrages and moonworts. These are things that we have evidence for from pollen deposits. The columns taken from Crowsmere, where the pollen is preserved in the lake sediments. So we've got rock roses. They're all things that are quite happy growing in sort of tundra conditions, like you would find these days on mountains in Sweden and Norway. Cloudberries, there's one in full fruit. They're absolutely delicious, I have to say. Crowberries, and this just to remind you that we are now, that was the Windermere Late Glacial Interstadial, and now we're going on to the Loch Lomond Stadial, and we've got, used to be referred to as the Younger Dryas, and this plant is Mountain Avens, which Latin name is Dryas octopetala. So this is the Dryas that period was named after. And heathers and dwarf birches. It's hard to tell it's a birch. I was quite surprised when I met one of these. They're hard. They're not as tall as your ankle. Really, really small. Dwarf willows can go from about ankle height to about knee height. This one's with lichens and mosses. There's another one. Very typical of mountainsides in Sweden now. Tundra vegetation above the tree line. So these are sort of a few landscapes that are the sort of thing we'll be looking at: the cotton grasses, the sedges, the damp patches. You can imagine that North Shropshire particularly would look very much like some of these images, with the wet bits, the shallow depressions before they start turning into mosses. Rather nice wetness. So once you get to the end of the Late Glacial Stadial, the Loch Lomond Advance, remember Shropshire wasn't covered by ice at this point, but it was fairly cold. you get a very rapid warming up, about 10,000 years ago, that sort of time. Within the lifetime of a human being, you would go from what was almost glacial conditions to temperate woodland. So we get the birch woodland, birch, pine, woodland developing, fairly open woodland, then followed by hazels and these sort of things, and quite rapidly developing into closed woodland. So some of these changes happen remarkably quickly. It was really the last time until now that such rapid climate change has affected the UK. And of course, when this was happening, we still had the land bridges. The land bridge to Europe, continental Europe, didn't flood really until about 8,500 years ago. So there was plenty of room for animals to move, because the habitat wasn't fragmented like it is now from human causes. It was quite easy for some of these larger animals just to wander off back across to Europe or over to Sweden. So there were plenty of escape routes as the climate warmed up. Of course, the situation we're facing now, that option isn't there. As the climate warms, we have no land bridges. There's nowhere for creatures that find it too warm for them. There's nowhere for them to go. So, it's not going to be a moving out. It's going to be a moving up. We're going to think things are going to have to go up hills as fast as they can. And once that becomes unsuitable for them, we're going to lose species. So, okay, we lost species at the end of the Loch Lomond Stadial. The pikers and things disappeared, but at least they had somewhere to go to. So just a last picture of the area around Ellesmere, showing the glacial moraines, the landscape forms, the hills and everything, all caused by the retreating glaciers, and here looking nicely wintry. And that's it for the Ice Age mammals. We can turn off Stuart's webcam now. It's done very well, 40,000 years. Batteries must have been better in those days. And just a quick point, really, one of the main things wildlife trusts in general are doing these days is trying to make landscape connections, so that as global warming pressurises populations of creatures, they do have a route to move to somewhere else, rather than being cut off in a little island and wiped out totally. And if you want to make a difference, if you want to help them and help us keep a really healthy environment and the ability for things to move around the countryside, if you want to do one thing, join us today. It can cost as little as £3 for an individual or adults only household, £3 a month, or £5 a month for a family with children, which, if you think about it, is less than a glossy magazine for you and a beano for the kids. Even if you got Cosmopolitan, it would still be. And you don't have to recycle it at the end of the month. It keeps on going. All the details are on the website. And this week's special offer, we do have a special offer. If you join after this, you can get a half-price adoption pack for a pine marten. So you can adopt a Shropshire pine marten. Usually it would be £20, and for only £10 you can adopt one of these for one of your nearest and dearest. What better present? Lots of things to enjoy for your staycation, for you and the kids, lots of reserves to visit, and a fabulous adopted pine marten to boot. You get a lovely certificate, tells you who adopted it for you. You get a full colour picture of it, looking dead cute, and a full colour illustrated fact sheet. So, adopt pine marten today. Look after the pine martens. Look after all of the wildlife, and help us to give it somewhere to go. Help us to make it robust populations that can move on. Thank you. Have we got any questions?
No.
No. Brilliant.
I could make one up.
You can make one up if you like.
I should have thought before I go. No, that's fine. There's nothing else to then.
Right.